tell me a little bit about what it is you do at the U of I.
I am what they call an access specialist. I work at Disability Resources and Educational Services, or DRES, at the University of Illinois. I work specifically with students who are deaf and hard of hearing and blind low vision, and I'm also the interpreter coordinator there.
So if a student, I imagine that they would undertake these steps prior to coming on campus, but can you kind of walk through what that is, how that process works for a student?
Sure. If a student is coming to the University of Illinois and they have a disability, in my particular instance, deaf and hard of hearing or blind low vision, they contact our department and fill out a online application. Once that's submitted, it gets sent to the right person and or the specific person, depending on the disability. And then I reach out to the student. They have to provide medical documentation that supports their disability. And we meet together for an interactive process where we work on talking about what accommodations they've had in the past, what accommodations they might need at the University of Illinois. And then we write a letter of accommodation together that they give all of their professors. And on that letter, it states that they have a disability and that they have the following accommodations that are listed on the letter. So it could be anything from closed captioning to ASL interpreting, preferential seating, live captioning. It could be anything.
So how much has your role changed in the last few months? I mean, obviously you don't have students on campus, but at the same time, I imagine the university is preparing in myriad ways for the future and what that's going to look like in different ways. And I imagine there's a e-learning component and that you're going to be factored in and your responsibilities are going to be factored into how that works.
Sure, but there's a enormous team of people who are making this possible. I cannot take credit by myself at all. I'm generally the coordinator. I find out which students need additional accommodations that they wouldn't maybe necessarily need if they were meeting face to face. For example, a lot of our hard of hearing students who would normally do fine in a class where they could sit up close to the professor and not really need any other accommodations, they go online to an online situation, and now they really do need either live captions if the class is being held live, or they'll need closed captions if the professor pre-records their lecture and then posts it online. We have a team of people at our accessible media services at DRES who do the closed captioning, as well as the CITL it's the CITL department, CITL, Center of Innovation and Technology and Learning, I think it is. And they've been phenomenal at helping us at DRES as well.
And I imagine that it's probably still a little early in the process, and some of this stuff is fluid, right?
Of course. I have no idea what the future holds. We have to just wait for the university to tell us what's going to happen. But right now, I'm just going to continue to provide remote closed captioning, remote live captioning services, and remote ASL interpreter and services.
And then what I found interesting, one of the many things that I found interesting when you and I were talking, is that you have firsthand experience, and I don't know, or personal experience, I guess it's not just firsthand experience, but personal experience. And I don't know if that's common in your field, that because did you say it was genetic for you, your hearing loss?
Yes.
So
yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I would say most people get involved in the deaf community who are hearing because they have some sort of connection to the deaf community. They've got family members or friends that they meet who are deaf or hard of hearing. That's certainly the way that I got involved in the deaf community. I became a teacher for the deaf, and then I was an interpreter for a while, and now I serve at the University of Illinois helping students who are deaf and hard of hearing. But I myself also have a hearing loss. I wear hearing aids, and so while I'm not profoundly deaf by any means, I do understand some of the issues that our deaf and hard of hearing community experiences. I have to have closed captioning when I watch TV. I find that it helps when I use the captioning when I go to the theaters, because there's a lot of things that I miss if I don't, because it's in the dark, and sounds that come from behind are hard for me to figure out what happened, or anybody talking off screen. So those are common issues that we have.
Was this something that you knew all your life? Was that you were going to get to this point, and is it something that is your hearing? Will it progressively deteriorate? Well, and has
No,
it always been?
yeah, no, I know I had no clue. I never paid attention to it. But my grandparents, all my aunts, my dad, started losing their hearing in their 40s, and so or maybe late 30s, and so I was having a little bit of trouble in my 30s, but I was still very much borderline. I was right on the just under the mild hearing loss line for a long time, and then in the last 3 years, I'd say it's gotten worse. So yeah, right now I have between moderate about a moderate hearing loss in both
So,
ears.
uh, what is it? What is it called?
Sensory neural bilateral moderate hearing loss. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because you said it was genetic, so I didn't. I was
Oh, I
curious.
don't know. I don't know that there's a name. I
Oh,
just know that my family, all of my aunts, my dad, everybody start. My cousin, who's a year younger than me, actually got hearing aids before me, and I, I was, yeah, that was a big influence that I needed to take the plunge.
so when you were studying, you had no idea that in 10 or 20 years that you were going to have the same experience.
No, I had no idea. I knew my grandfather had hearing aids, but I thought it was just because he was old. I didn't realize that that he actually started it earlier in his adult life and progressively got worse. Yeah.
Uh, How has I have to imagine that having gone through um, all of the learning that you've gone through and the teaching experiences that you've gone through um, must be uh, you know must have been a very gratifying experience because you have had this deeper familial connection, but then you had this very personal experience with it as well. um, I mean, what was that like?
Uh,
Was it just kind of
I
like, oh my gosh, it's happened to everybody in my family, so now it's happened to me too, or was it kind of like,
it was an easy transition for me, only because I do know sign language. I'm not as good at it as I used to be. I'm getting arthritis in my hands, but I understand it and communicate with deaf people daily. And it wasn't as intense of a adjustment for me. Now my family, I would say differently. They get very frustrated when they call me from across the house and I don't hear, or I don't answer, or I will often misunderstand things that they say. And it's always something really crazy, which I'll say back and they're like, no, that's not what I said. It's usually amusing, but yeah, for me, it was an easier transition because of my experience and my love of the deaf community and love of the children and students, and now college students that I get to work with. It's a blessing.
has so the initial reason that I got connected with you, we haven't even discussed, which is this mask issue that has really cropped up in what has essentially been almost 2 months now, with uh, this pandemic. And I think that if you don't have a connection to the deaf community or people who are hard of hearing, it probably doesn't even occur to you that this would um, be an issue. And like I mentioned, I mean, it took until this past weekend for my wife and I to even start talking about it. And now it's like, oh well, this is like, this is something that's right in our home. And then, when you and I were talking about it on the phone, masks that have you know a plastic see-through spot, but then that's not something that you could necessarily just make in your home, as
Well,
so many people
you
are
might
making.
be able to.
Yeah.
That would be really helpful. And there are a lot of really creative people out there who might be able to figure out a way to do something like that. You're exactly right. It's a great need for all of the deaf and hard of hearing community. Um, I know that when I go to the dentist and they have to wear the masks, I have to ask them to face me and lift it just so that I can make sure I understand what they're saying. So it's the same for, I mean, deaf and hard of hearing, but also, I mean, well, let me start again. If you're deaf, you need to see those facial expressions so that you can understand what's being said, even when something's being signed. And if you're hard of hearing, you need to be able to lip read, which obviously is impossible through fabric. And oftentimes the fabric muffles the sound. So, yeah, it's an issue. It's a real concern for a lot of deaf and hard of hearing individuals.
And have you watched many or any of the governor's news conferences?
I have. Their interpreters are amazing.
And that's something that I wanted to ask you about because of what you were just saying, that obviously the interpreter is always signing, but you said it is also important to see his mouth, right? Because
Facial expressions,
facial expression. But
eyebrows, uh, lips, mouth, cheeks, all of that is involved in ASL. That's a part of the language.
right, so he is, because I think it's been, there's one primary individual who has been doing it, but there is a second man who's been in and out, but um, you never see them wearing masks. And as you just pointed out, there's an important reason for that.
Right.
And uh, and so, as you said, that translates to people going to the store. Obviously, if anybody who needs to go to the grocery store, that's going to be important. I think, especially as that comes up now at the end of the week when the governor's mask mandate really takes effect. What do you have any advice, or what would you say, for folks who, either, I'm sure there are people who are thinking in their heads who probably are concerned about what a trip to the store is going to be like, if they don't have a mask that has that transparency. And then even for these store owners, maybe who haven't thought about how to deal with or handle a community that can't communicate in the same way that um, the majority of the state can.
Um, well, there's a couple of lines of thought along that line. One is that as when you have deaf and hard of hearing individuals going to different stores, if they're going in to get something quick and get out, they really may not have to have a tremendous amount of communication. They can look at the screen and see how much it is and hand them their card or whatever.
Sure.
And a lot of times, deaf and hard of hearing individuals will use their phone to text messages and hold it up and show it to whoever they're talking to if they're not fluent in sign language. So that's one way that they could get around it. The problem is that when you're going into stores or places where you need assistance, that's where the issue really comes through, where you've got to ask for help for something. And the truth is, I've seen online masks that have opening that are clear so that you can see the lips, but I've never personally seen one ever in person or have anybody use one in my presence. I just don't think there's something that's common. I think they're relatively new. I know that I've seen a few ads on Facebook recently where a couple of articles of people who have been trying to create them, which I think is wonderful. Because especially if a person is sick, uh, and they have to go to the emergency room or to the hospital, they really need to be able to see and understand, you know, even if they have an interpreter with them at the hospital, they would need to be able to see that interpreter's mouth along with the signs. So, I mean, it is definitely a true need in our community. I don't know. I've never been able to find one. I've looked. They're not common, obviously. So I think the need is, you know, if we can find some creative people out there who can figure out a way to sew some masks that are clear for especially for use of our doctors and people in the community, um, that'd be amazing.
Is there anything else that I haven't asked you about that you think would be important to share with the people who are going to see this?
Um, I think just the understanding and having compassion if someone is struggling to communicate and understand. Most likely, your deaf and hard of hearing person will type something on their computer or their phone, but just taking an extra few moments to try to communicate and understand what their need is. And I mean, deaf and hard of hearing people are amazing; they can do anything. So they just need a little assistance sometimes in communication from hearing people who don't know sign. So, yeah, compassion, patience, and understanding.
That's probably good advice anytime.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me. I probably took up a little more time than I had promised earlier, but
Oh,
I
you're
appreciate it.
fine.